Here we go. We're not going to do a constant back and forth here about the Civil War, but a couple of points here. Um, of course, we'd like to all think it was about slavery, and that was the thing. But when you think about it logically, when has war ever been a moral conflict? Ever. Now, who is going to send their children off their own farms and their own incomes to go fight for black slaves in the North? Does that make any logical sense? Why was 40% of the Union Army immigrants, militia, mercenaries? And the only way they could have won the war was with that. Why wasn't the North gathered up in arms about those evil Confederates who owned slaves? You know, the truth about the Civil War is simply the fact that we were taken over by essentially foreign bankers. That's what the truth of the Civil War was. That was the entire reason to have the Civil War. Now, you can say that there's political motivations here and there, and everyone's got their opinions about this and that. And obviously, morally, people probably didn't agree with slavery on a large scale back then. That doesn't mean they're going to send their kids to go off and go die. Okay? Doesn't make any logical sense. And you want to have this moral, say that the Union was moral and just, and the only thing they wanted was to free the slaves. Why did they go west during the Civil War and slaughter all the Indians? It makes a little more sense that those people who shipped over $1 billion in gold bullion to pay troops wanted to take over the entire territory. Makes a slight bit more sense than talking about African slaves. So, why did the war start? 1864 presidential election. The guy, Abe Lincoln, was in office for like a couple of months and declared war. Okay. 1864 presidential election. 10 states, the southern states of the Confederacy, Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on a ballot. Shows you how legitimate the guy's presidency was. And because of that, they have no representation. They're completely just and breaking away and ignoring what the North was doing. They don't have any representation. Lincoln turns around and essentially declares war on them. And you can say, well, the South attacked first, PSYOP. I would guarantee you that they did everything just like in World War II to provoke an attack. You think Japan just decided, well, let's attack America? Or did President Roosevelt do everything in his power he could possibly do to agitate the Japanese to attack? That's how these things work. There was no moral thing about that. Would America have gone to war at all after World War II or World War I if the Japanese had not attacked? No. But part of the plan is to get America into the war. And Roosevelt was a commie. Lincoln was a commie. Global. Back then, back in the day. Imagine that. Wow. Now, this idea that the North was just all of these moral lads who left working on the farm and lurking in their own lives and their own wives and their own children to go fight in the war against slavery because it was their moral obligation is silly. Here's the proof. Time magazine, one of many proofs. We'll start paragraph 2. Meanwhile, immigrants already in the United States responded to the call of arms in extraordinary numbers. In 1860, about 13% of the U.S. population was born overseas. So like 1 in 10 people. Roughly what it is today. 1 in every 4 members of the Union Armed Forces was an immigrant. 1 in every 4. How does that math work out? Some 543,000 of more than 2 million Union soldiers by recent estimates, another 18%, at least one foreign-born parent, together immigrants, sons of immigrants, made up 43%. 43% of the Union Army. Yeah. Where did they come from? America's foreign legions gave the North incalculable advantage. It could never have been won without them. And yet the role of immigrant soldiers has been ignored in the narrative brothers of war fought by American soil, by American soldiers over the issues that were uniquely American in origin. Tell me, who is going to flee to a country that there's a civil war going on? Who is going to pay to get on the boat and go, I'm going to go make myself a home in America with a civil war going on? You know who? People who don't have nothing, and the guy out there is going, yeah, we'll give you a plot of land, we'll give you gold, we'll give you liquor, we'll give you whatever you want, just get on the boat, be a slave in the Union Army for 4 years, or they didn't know at the time, but be a slave in the Union Army, and then when it's done, you'll get paid. Go be a mercenary. That's where these guys come from. I don't know what to say if you don't want to agree with that, because this is like, you just look it up. Wikipedia. This is Time magazine. Granted, they skew the narrative and they say that these poor people had fought against their own government and they just thought that they could make a difference over here. Everyone's all these moral, righteous, standing people. It's like, nobody would do that. That's not rational. It's not reasonable. What is reasonable is that they were paid to come over here. And the North had $1 billion in gold bullion to do that with because they sold all their bonds. The Confederacy couldn't sell their stuff. The North had no problem. Who was buying them? Who was buying those bonds? Remember, they can't just make ones and zeros in a computer system back then. They actually had to have the gold. Who at that time had the gold? Who? In the 1860s, Confederate diplomats and supporters abroad were eager to inform Europeans that the North was actively recruiting their sons to serve as cannon fodder. In one pamphlet, the Confederate envoy Edwin de Leon informed French readers that the Puritan North had built its army in large part of foreign mercenaries made up of the refuse of the old world. Okay? Now, I think that the South would have won the war with God's help if they would have gotten rid of the slaves. But you know what was for certain? If they emancipated the slaves at any point during that war, the Union Army would not have stopped. Because their goal was not to free the slaves. Their goal was consolidation of power. Okay? Why is it all the Confederate soldiers there are in the east and the southeast? Why did they turn west immediately and start killing Indians? Why did the Indians form alliances with the Confederacy? That's got to be about slaves, because the Indians care about slaves. All of those black slaves the Indians had. Uh, 1864 presidential election. Yes, of course. Lincoln wasn't voted in by America. He was voted in by just the northern, 40% of the popular vote or something. Wonderful President Lincoln, who cared so morally and deeply about the plight of the southern slaves, does not care about writ of habeas corpus, doesn't care about democracy, doesn't care about the constitutional system, suspends rights because he feels like it. Was a complete accident. He got shot in the head by a lone nut. Complete accident. Essential Civil War curriculum. Immigrants in the Union Army. Over 200,000 German and 150,000 Irish-born men volunteered to serve in the Union armies. Volunteered. Immigrant soldiers forming a striking presence in the Union armies. Over 200,000 German, 150,000 Irish-born men volunteered to serve in the Federal Army between 1861 and 1865. And while a majority of these men enlisted in ethnically mixed regiments, units in the Army of the Potomac, such as the Irish Brigade and mostly German 11th Corps, became synonymous with the ethnic experience during the war. Immigrant service is especially interesting when viewed from the perspective of the nation-building process that occurred during the war, as an ethnic sacrifice on the field proved worthiness of these adopted citizens to American Republic, aka we will make you citizens and give you land and give you money if you come and fight our war for us. Ethnic service was not, however, spontaneous and must be understood within the broader context of mid-19th century immigrant experience. While federal armies were incredibly diverse and contained a large number of foreign-born men, Irish-German volunteers were by far the most numerous. This essay explores the origins of the 19th century European immigration and the experience these men and women in the United States, the reaction of ethnic Americans to the outbreak of sectional conflict, the motivations behind motivations, ethnic service, post-war implications of immigrant sacrifice defense in the Union. They all came here because they were paid and promised new life. Fighting a war, we'll pay you. Okay? Obvious. The Union had a 2-to-1 advantage over the South because they had their ports open and were accepting immigrants all over the place. That's how they won. Again, God would have been on the South side if they would have given up slaves. But again, if they would have, it wouldn't have stopped the North. It wouldn't have stopped them at all. This is Native Americans in the Civil War. Good old Honest Abe. The West was mostly peaceful during the war due to the lack of U.S. occupational troops. It's the Native Americans' land. Native Americans' land. We have all these purchases, Louisiana Purchase and the California Purchase, and all these purchases from countries that weren't here. It was money to make sure they didn't interfere with our taking over. Federal government was still taking control of native land, and there were continuous fights. But the moral implications of having black slaves in the South, we got to stop them. Oh, Indians, they're not people. No, it's always about money. It's always about power. It's always about control. There ain't no moral anything. Nothing has changed from today. There's very, very few things that are ever a moral issue when it comes to government. I would say none. When it comes to government, power, control. From January to May 1863, there were almost continuous fights in New Mexico territory as concerted effort by the federal government to contain and control the Apache. In the midst of this, President Abraham Lincoln met with representatives from several major tribes and informed them he felt concerned they would never attain the prosperity of the white race unless they turned to farming as a way of life. Good old Honest Abe. It was all about black slavery. All about black slavery. Pacific Northwest. Let's see. In the late 1870s, another series. This is, all the way through here. We're going to start all these conflicts with the Indians here. All through the 1860s and war started. It's like as soon as 1861 hit, you have the Union forces going south, but then they also went west and declared war on Indians. It was about slavery. So in southwest Oregon, tensions and skirmishes escalated between American settlers and the rogue river peoples, river wars, 1855-56, California gold rush, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, because we're coming in there starting problems with Indians. The discovery of gold in Idaho and Oregon in the 1860s led to similar conflicts, which culminated in the Bear River Massacre 1863, right? Because we're trying to get gold to finance our hostile takeover. In the late 1870s, another series of armed conflicts occur in Oregon and Idaho, spreading east, Wyoming and Montana. The Nez Perce, 1877, blah, 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 blah. I mean, you go through this whole deal of primarily starting in like Minnesota, where like the largest mass execution that America's ever had was slaughtering a bunch of Indians because we went back on our deal to feed them, and they were a little upset about that. And then after they attacked to get their food, we basically slaughtered them, declared them criminals, suspend habeas corpus. And yeah, what does all of this over here have to do with the Civil War that's going on during that period? Where did they finance all of this? Warring with the native populations. Yeah, but hey, Civil War is a moral conflict about slavery. Absolutely not. It's a byproduct of it. And yeah, slavery's bad. Everyone agrees on that. And I think everybody back in that day would agree on that too. But this idea that, just because there are some wealthy people in the South who depended on slavery to keep their wealth does not mean that young men and families are going to be broken up to try and protect these guys who own all the slaves. Remember, this is supposed to be the place where everyone is sovereign and has rights. Everyone would need to agree to do the war thing. And there's a lot of people in the North that went to the South because they agreed with the states' rights, supposedly. That terminology of states' rights. Well, really, it was the people's rights that were gathered and lived on the territory of those borders. And Abraham Lincoln was for the globalists and Britain and the complex. Okay? It's what it was. And of course you have some Rothschilds in there too, who just happened to be sitting on $1 billion of gold bullion to finance the whole thing. Okay? And of course, America was in a depression and completely bankrupt after that until 1913, where we get the new Federal Reserve System and the creature from Jekyll Island. But Civil War all about slaves. All about slaves. We care so morally deeply about the plight of the black slave back in 1861. But nowadays, we apparently like to have them in ghettos and Planned Parenthood all over the place and break their families up and do all these horrible things. Native Americans, meh. Don't try and make this about a moral thing, because it looks terrible. Okay? From a morality standpoint, it looks awful. Millions of people died to free black slaves. Black people were fighting. There's more black people fighting in the Confederate Army than there was black people fighting in the Northern Army, the Union Army. So that's what I got. And, this isn't anything that I'm not going to dwell on this stuff. It's just if you want to know the origins of how Admiralty law came about, how the Federal Reserve System came about, and how everybody lost all their sovereignty, you go to the Civil War. They say Civil War freed the slaves. No, it made slaves out of everybody. Made debt slaves out of everybody. And, instead of having individual sovereignty and then going to state sovereignty and then to the federal government as far as a power structure, it flipped it all on its head, and the federal government decides what you're allowed to do, your privileges, right? Federal government dictates that now. Before it was the Constitution, and you allow the government to do X, Y, Z. No, not anymore. Now you have privileges. Now you're a person. You're not a human being. You're not an individual. You're a person. Dictated by statutes, given privileges. That's where it all comes from, is the Civil War. So, with that, I think we's going to be out of here.